Good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to the session entitled Greening the Manifestos, asking the question, what must the parties pledge for a sustainable UK? My name is Tony Juniper. It's my pleasure to be here this afternoon in my capacity as the President of Society for the Environment and to chair a session including 4 expert speakers who are hopefully going to take us a little bit closer to understanding the answer to that question. Society for the Environment is an organisation with a royal charter, and it uses that platform to accredit the qualification of chartered environmentalist. We do that through a network of 23 professional organisations, and the aim that we have is to mainstream and professionalise environmental best practice across a range of different disciplines. So taking environmentalism from the ghetto and putting it in very mainstream disciplines, including engineering, surveying, architecture, biology, chemistry, farming, fisheries, forestry, and the rest. We've been on the journey for about 10 years. We've now accredited something like 7,000 chartered environmentalists through a very rigorous assessment process, and we're looking forward to chartering many more in the years ahead, and hopefully in the process putting environmentalism where it needs to be, at the heart of our economy rather than marginal to it. And putting the environment at the heart of our economic plans is very much the spirit of what today's panel is about. We're looking for proposals to bring green growth back to the fore. Many of you may remember in the run-up to the 2010 general election, a great deal of discussion about how it would be possible to cut carbon, save resources, protect biodiversity, at the same time as growing the economy and creating a more competitive, vibrant business sector. That particular discussion has gone slightly off the boil in recent years, but it will come back, not least because of events unfolding around us in the real world. But to help get that discussion going between now and the 2015 general election, Society for the Environment, in the spirit of being a forum for debate as well as being the organisation that charters environmentalists, has opened a space that we are inviting people to join in, to debate and consider options, and through that process to publish a report in the autumn setting out some of the thinking that's emerged from the conversation we'll have with the very informed people who are in this room, on the panel, in the 7,000 chartered environmentalists, in the professional organisations, and more widely in society, so that we can put something out there before the parties finalise their manifestos, hopefully providing some inspiration as to how we might get back on track towards that goal of aligning environmental and ecological goals, which of course is the central mission of sustainable development. So what we're going to do today is to hear from the 4 experts on the panel. I'll briefly introduce those in a moment. This event is launching the process up to the autumn when we'll publish the report with proposals for the manifestos. So today really is to get the conversation going, to get some of the ideas onto the table. We'll be running a website, we'll be active on Twitter, trying to invite more people into the conversation so that we can come with a very rich set of ideas by the end of the summer, and to hopefully inspire something that we can recognise in manifestos next spring. So in terms of the panel today, I'll just introduce them very briefly in order of their contribution. They will say a little bit more about themselves if they wish as we get into their brief proposals. So first of all, we have here Martin Baxter, Director of Policy at the Institute of Environmental Management and Assessment, actually one of the first ever chartered environmentalists, I think number 2 in the world, quite an accolade. If you think about a limited edition painting and you've got 7,000 of them and you see number 2, you think that's a real collector's item. There he is. We should get him framed. Second, we have my dear friend and colleague Sarah Nollith, who's the director of the Prince's Accounting for Sustainability project, bringing environmental and sustainability thinking to a whole new financial audience. Fantastic work going on there. We have Robert Hunt, executive director of Veolia, a company recognised for its leadership on sustainability. And last but not least, we have Julia Groves, who's trialling and indeed practicing innovative financing mechanisms for renewable energy through her work as managing director of the Trillion Fund. So I'm going to invite each of them to give us a few minutes each, then we'll have a little conversation on the panel, we'll open it to the floor, and then we'll wrap up hopefully with a few clear conclusions. Over to you.
Okay, well, thank you, Tony. I think there is a saying that, first is a winner and second is absolutely nowhere. So being the second environmentalist in the world is not a particularly great accolade to carry, but being first on the panel does give me that privilege of maybe setting a more strategic view of what we might want to see from a commitment from the parties in terms of green growth and a sustainable economy. And I think for me, what I would like them to do is to set out what they actually mean by a sustainable economy. Because I think you could be forgiven for thinking that this was just about delivering economic growth, that it was just about purely financial metrics, and actually it was completely outside the scope of delivering a cleaner, greener environment and actually delivering social progress. So for me, I would like something around defining a sustainable economy in terms of delivering social and economic value in a low carbon, resource efficient way. I'd like to see one that operates within environmental limits. I'd like to see an economy and a society in the UK that was much more resilient to environmental change and one that respects human rights. I think when you start to frame an overarching policy commitment along those lines and drive that through different economic and social policies, then you start to integrate environment right into the core of decision making. I think that's exactly where it has to be. I think when you start to look at some of the big challenges that are going to be faced by the next government and the opportunity that will arise, I think the first one has got to be climate change. I think we saw yesterday the launch of the IPCC's second working group report on the vulnerability that we have to a changing climate on a global basis and the sorts of impacts that we're going to see. So I would like to see all of the political parties and their leaders commit to the UK being a leader in negotiating the next global climate change agreement, and I would like a commitment from all the party leaders to attend that conference in 2015 where we should be setting a global agreement and actually to lead from the front. Why do I say that? Well, firstly, I think that there are significant jobs to be had in a green economy. There are over 1 million people working in green jobs in the UK. The balance of payment shows that there was a 5 billion surplus from green business. And I think in a global race, it's absolutely critical for UK manufacturing and UK companies to be actually not only making our own economy more resilient, but actually rebalancing our economic activity with exports. So yes, I'd like to see us leading in climate change negotiations. I would also like to see us being a strong player in the EU in that regard, and that's probably ahead of the election, to be honest, because the next package in the EU will be finalised and go through voting this year. But they will also have the responsibility of delivering the fifth carbon budget. So for the period of 2028 to 2033, this next government will be setting that agenda. And I think it's crucial that they take the advice of the Independent Committee on Climate Change for the most cost-effective measures for achieving those policy outcomes and actually making decisions today and next year and throughout the next Parliament that will set us on that trajectory. I think if you could be forgiven for looking at the budget a few weeks ago and wondering where the hell the green economy had actually gone. So you wouldn't recognise the number of jobs that were in there. You would see that we are, as well as supporting renewable energy, but we're also subsidising fossil fuels. I think it was Lord Brown, former CEO of BP, who said the subsidies that we offer both for renewables and for fossil fuel generation is akin to having the central heating on full belt and the air conditioning on full belt and the windows open. I mean, that is the sort of policy landscape that we are currently subsidising. I think we have to take a fresh approach about where we actually put our capital and give long-term policy certainty within which investors can deliver the funding that's required to deliver a more coherent energy policy and also invest in the infrastructure that we're going to need to accommodate an increasing UK population. Between 2010 and 2033, there's something like a 17% increase in UK population that will drive demand for water resources, for transport and communication. And all of that has to be done in a way which will be done in a way which is far lower carbon. A couple of other things, if I've got Scott. You see, this is the benefit of going first. Yeah, I think we need other metrics other than GDP to measure the real success of the UK as a nation, one that delivers social value as well as economic value. So I think this is about how we develop, and it all has already started, but put on a par the metrics around accounting for natural capital at a national level, and then start to bring in policies which will ensure that we don't undermine natural capital in forthcoming parliaments. And the final one is what I would call policy coherence and integration. Last week, I think it was there was a vote in Parliament, well, should we cap welfare spending at £120 billion a year? DEFRA's budget is less than £4 billion a year. DEC's budget is less than £4 billion a year. So when people suggest that this might be too expensive on environment, I think when you look at overall government spending, and then you see, the paucity of money which is actually invested in protecting homes and businesses from flooding, the ability to build resilience in our economy, and one which is green, and the jobs that would come from that, then I think that starts to set an agenda for the next government, whichever colour it might be, but it has to have a green thread running right the way through its policy commitments.
Thanks very much indeed, Martin. Sarah, would you like to pick up the conversation?
Yeah, thanks, Tony. As Tony said, I am the director of something called Accounting for Sustainability, which is an initiative of the Prince of Wales that works with the accounting and finance community, both within business and governments, to help them understand the link between sustainability and improved financial outcomes. And given this is all around sustainable economic growth, I think we do need to look to the business community, who are going to be the underlying driver of that growth, and how we can create the right framework to promote the innovation that's really needed within that business community to get the right financial and sustainability outcomes. I think there's a real increasing interest in sustainability from the business community, and really importantly, we're seeing that interest increase within the finance people within that community, so the finance directors, the chief financial officers, etc., because they can increasingly see the link between looking after scarce resources, the opportunities that also offers in terms of new markets, and actually their financial bottom line. And I think there's an awful lot that policy framework can do to encourage that kind of innovation. The benefits for business will obviously depend on what sector you're in, and it can be a mixture of risks and opportunities. On the opportunity side, we've seen high-profile companies like GE with their eco-imagination. There's interesting things going on with some of the life science companies like Royal DSM, who are doing things like working with their customers. One of the products that they produce is paint for large commercial shipping vehicles. They've used things like biomimicry to develop a new type of paint which helps the boats go through the water smoother and faster, therefore saving their customers an awful lot of fuel costs. That also then has a great knock-on effect in terms of the carbon emissions. Now, they wouldn't have looked at those new innovations if they weren't looking through that green lens to say, actually, how do we help our customers solve some of their environmental footprint problems. So, there's a real benefit to using this green lens to foster innovation and coming up with solutions that are both lower cost, potentially generate higher revenues, but also save the environment. In terms of the risk side, there's interesting work going on in terms of how do you lower both your financial and environmental risk. You get water companies looking at how they improve their catchment management by working with the local farmers to reduce the amount of pollutants that go within the water so that they don't have to spend huge amounts of capital expenditure on building new water treatments, for example. Actually, the cost benefit of these calculations, one of the water companies we work with worked out that it was a 65-to-1 benefit they were getting from working with the farmers, doing simple things like building pens for their sheep or containers for their fertiliser to stop some of these pollutants going into the environment compared to the cost of building a huge water treatment plant. So there's some really easy things that people can do that they're not doing at the moment. One of the roles that the policy environment can play is to start fostering that innovation by making companies think about this. There's a really big buzzword at the moment around natural capital accounting. The government are thinking about this a lot at a national level. We do have government natural capital accounts. I came from the House of Commons this morning for an event for the MPs looking at what's actually going on at a national level, how they can take this further forward, and really importantly how they can link this to what's going on at a business level. There needs to be much more done in this space. We need policy that encourages and even requires companies to do natural capital measurement and accounting so they really understand their impacts, and importantly look to start reporting this so that the investor community can start making decisions on the back of it. It's a really good indication of future business risk for the investor community. We also need to link this in with the national government natural capital accounts and actually get much more dialogue between the two, corporate and the government, around how we can all link this together. And I'd like to see things like the Ecosystems Market Task Force that try to do part of that try to look at actually where the opportunities are for business that can also help the government meet their targets. They came up, and Tony can talk about this, they came up with lots of really great recommendations that aren't really being taken forward. So I think my kind of overall message is anything that the policy environment can do to foster companies to look at their corporate national capital accounting and therefore promote innovation, which is I think the only thing we're going to, the only way that we're going to drive growth that is both financially and environmentally sustainable.
Robert, I think you'd probably agree with quite a lot of that, wouldn't you?
I would indeed. And I was very interested to hear that. The politician I most admire, which might sound a bit bizarre, is Sir Robert Peel, credited for bringing about a police force, but also parliamentary reform. And why do I admire him so much? Because he actually thought of Britain, and if it suited him to do a deal with the opposition, that's just what he would do to get legislation through Parliament. And I think there's probably three topics that are way and above party politics. The first, I think, is education. The second is how we're going to deal with social care, because that is the biggest problem facing all of us. And the third, I think, is the environment. And I spend quite a lot of my time down in Westminster because external affairs is part of my brief within Veolia. And everybody's talking about the circular economy, sustainable economy and jobs, but actually nobody's articulating necessarily what that means. And I think effectively a lot of our environmental legislation and regulation is framed about what you can't do. And quite rightly, you've got to protect the environment, you've got to stop polluters, etc. But what I hope is we start turning the debate to perhaps behaviours and encouraging behaviours up here in the head. So that's particularly in the education sector, getting young people into understanding why the environment's so important, because no environment, no jobs, no anywhere. That is the simple thesis at the end of the day. So that it's a question of getting people to understand what sustainability means. And I brought some props with me today. This used to be sewage sludge. This used to be cardboard and is going to be loft insulation or egg boxes. This used to be a plastic bottle and it's going to be a plastic bottle. So effectively, rather than using raw materials or raw oil or whatever, one's actually capturing materials which would otherwise be that wicked word waste and moving them back into an economy. And these do create jobs. It actually returns resource to the UK, and I think effectively, and Veolia is big in all three areas of heat, waste management and treatment, and water, is we're short of energy. There's no doubt about that. We've got to have a proper structured policy and plan for how we are going to resource Britain's energy needs. We're short of water too. We waste a lot of water. There aren't enough reservoirs, so that it is a question of planning how we use resources efficiently, thoughtfully and carefully. And I think also, and business gets traduced quite a lot of the time, you want to develop and despoil Britain's green and pleasant land. Not a bit of it. I do not want to develop on green land. I would much, much rather develop used land, as it were, or brown land, to use the pejorative phrase. Why? Because it's generally got better grid connection, better highway connections, and it's generally in a place where people live and work, where you need the infrastructure or the resources, so that effectively you need to sort of join the thinking, because there's no doubt about it, we need better infrastructure. I go to France a lot. Their infrastructure is far superior to ours. We're catching up, but we need, as a vibrant, leading world economy, infrastructure to power that economy. But it has to be with this green thinking, so that development needs to be thought of. And we've got at the moment a golden opportunity with a garden city to be built in Kent. And I'm going to make my way down to the Cabinet Office or wherever else and say, please, 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 design it sustainably. Capture your water, capture your rainwater, have a transport system that is the minimum that you need and isn't dictated by the car, but dictated by how people want to live. So it's really a question, I think, of getting a cultural drive from government. And actually green isn't something that's precious or on the edge of thinking. It actually should be in all of our thinking, and actually regard the environment as something to be husbanded and handed on to the next generation, and we're only here for a short period of time. Use the materials wisely, turn it into a circular thesis and a circular economy in a genuine way.
Thanks, Robert. You've got to reassure me, though, that sewage sludge has not been turned into bubble gum. That's what it looks like.
What I generally, the examples I get are gaming chips. I don't know what people think I do in my spare time, but anyway, there we are.
Thanks very much indeed. Julia.
So can I just commend SocEnv in the first place? I think the idea of crowdsourcing a practical solution to the problems is a very, very good one. We'll definitely need a fairly large crowd to achieve the kind of change we're looking at. And we also need to work to timescales, frankly, beyond the next political cycles. I think that's half the challenge, is that we're working in 4-year election timeframes, and that means the people have to do it. So I worked in wind and solar for about 9 years. I began by working on a rather beautiful vertical axis wind turbine, which had a wonderful aerodynamic output. Unfortunately, the grid losses were slightly disappointing. So I've tried to use beauty to overcome obstacles to adopting more sustainable technologies. And then I switched to solar really for therapy, because the solar actually worked, and to try to appeal to people purely through profit as motivation. I could show and share some of my unsuccessful Google campaigns, which range from legacy for your children to polar bears. And frankly, outside this stadium, nobody gives a monkeys. People are really thinking about what's in it for them. And to try and ask them to do more than that, particularly if you're a single mum with a couple of kids in tow, you're not going to have baked beans on a Friday night instead of chicken, so as you can pay more for your green electricity. So in my world, we have to make the money work at the same time. So the reason I got into the world of money was in that solar business, we were installing roof by roof, me thinking I'll get the panels on the roof, I'll ignore the 4x4 parked outside, we'll get the panels on, we'll give them a little meter, and they'll start to think about energy and carbon as a currency, and this is the beginning of a journey for them. We had a little tussle with the government around some feed-in tariff degradations, a little thing called the Cut Don't Kill campaign, for those who remember it, which thankfully we won. But really, I think the most important thing as a starting point for renewable technologies is we need a long-term, consistent subsidy regime, not one that chops and changes on a regular basis. I fired people that I could have then hired back 4 months later. And that needs to be a level playing field also with the fossil fuel guys. I mean, I read things about 10 times the amount of subsidy going into fossil fuel exploration, which is pretty risky and pretty expensive. We just want green energy to compete fair and square, and we need the energy market to be transparent and actually as broad as well as open as it can be. And for me, that probably means more interconnection with Europe to help with intermittency and the balance of payments there. But a lot of this for me is about the left hand talking to the right hand, which I realise immediately I say it sounds overly ambitious. But if we could get energy policy and fiscal policy to connect, that really would be something. we want to try and remove the barriers to people being able to participate. So Trillion Fund, which is our platform, is trying to get as many people, normal people, not rich people, normal people, to have a small financial stake in the future of energy in the UK. And we've had to work very hard lobbying the Financial Conduct Authority. I now sit on Her Majesty's Treasury's working group on ISAs, because that totally fits in my job title, to try and make sure the door remains open. The theory being that when each of us has a financial return of some kind from the future of energy, we've got something at stake. And, you know, solar panels are wonderful. I get a check from Ecotricity once a year, but we have 4 million people renting in the UK who really can't influence their property or make it more efficient or plug renewables in, but who have a little bit of money that they could invest in somebody else's roof or a solar farm nearby. So the real breakthrough, I guess, last week was the announcement on ISAs, and you probably didn't see the word green in there, but the Treasury have agreed that from next year we will be able to offer energy loans and bonds under an ISA remit. And I've been trying to do green ISAs for a long time. I'm sure other people in the room have as well. And it's not just the fact that that makes it a good tax break, it's the fact that that ISA brand is there and the government is saying this is the kind of thing to put your money into. It's 22 million people have 460 billion pounds tied up in ISAs. We're hearing more and more about divestment. Even a small percentage of that number could be a significant boost. I mean, 1% of ISA money would be more than the Green Investment Bank's entire budget from that perspective. So I think that's really powerful. Because for me, the message overall is the politicians are going to do what they have to do to win the election and get the vote. Ultimately, the power is down to us. And if we start to move our money, whether we're switching away from the utilities who aren't offering green alternatives, or whether we're putting our money into solar farms and switching our ISA money across, by doing that, even a small percentage of change is enough to put the willies up the utility companies, just as it is the banks. So all of the messages for me are around doing whatever they can to facilitate engagement, which in some cases includes money. So 3 suggestions there. I'm a big fan of community energy and the right to buy scheme. They're looking at mandating that if somebody is building any energy farm near you, you have a right to participate. And I don't mean 1% of the profits from fracking. I mean a significant ownership and revenue stream coming back steadily, normally between 5 and 7% a year. And I think you'll struggle to get that in the banks. I think the Green Investment Bank mobilisation objective shouldn't be just about the amount of money they mobilise, but also the number of people that they can get to engage, because that's how we break down the barriers. That's how you get past NIMBYism. When there's a buck in it for them, it goes kind of from this to kind of, maybe I don't hate turbines after all. And I think that also there's a lot that people like local government and actually some of the corporates in the room could do to lead the way, but to do it with their customers at the same time. So turning those customers into lenders and investors, but with match funding in place. If I think that every pound I put into a solar farm means Matalan will put a pound in at the same time, and it's coming out of my ISA, I'm going to do that purely for financial reasons. But then I have the nice dinner party story to talk about how I'm saving the planet at the same time. So for me, I'm afraid it's about the money.
Very good. Thanks very much indeed. And actually, on that last point, Julia, I think if you think about what's happened since the last general election, exactly that has been the point of government. It's about the money. But what we've seen, instead of the kind of progress that you're describing, is the opposite, in the sense of we can't afford to do environmental protection, we can't afford renewable energy, we can't afford to have higher standards, because this is anti-growth, it is anti-competitive and against the interests of economic recovery. That's been the narrative, and yet what all of you have said on the panel today is really a very different narrative. It is one of opportunity, it's one of being able to garner business advantage by better managing risk. It's about being competitive on the international stage through being able to export and build industries that have got a global facing component through taking action on climate change, for example. And as you were saying, Robert, is about ways in which you can do business differently in a circular economy. So that's very interesting straight away, isn't it? Is that we've got the panel coming from different perspectives, converging around the idea that actually there is a different narrative here. I wonder if any of you have got any good ideas as to how we can unlock that different perspective on all of this before the election? Because if we go into manifesto writing, which is in that old frame of we can't afford it, it's against growth, it's a choice between environment or economy, it's jobs and growth versus nature. If we don't break that, how are we going to get through? Robert, actually, I have to say, I'm kind of thinking that the business voice here might be quite important. What do you think?
If effectively, and I talked to a number of our large corporate customers, I was at an event last night, is big companies, the Procter & Gamble's, the GSK's, actually are very conscious of the environmental effects of what they are doing. And indeed, they want to be circular. We've got a project running with one of our big industrial customers that makes a product that I guarantee is in your kitchen, to actually circulate the water that they use in that manufacturing process, treat it, filter it, and send it straight back into that manufacturing process so you're not drawing it back off the resource water supply. Why is that interesting? Because it's cheaper for them at the end of the day rather than to be paying for those resources. So I think the sort of thesis here has got to be green isn't expensive. Green can be smart if you look at it in the right way. And again, I made the comment earlier, we're not sort of people occupying tunnels or hugging a tree or whatever, however laudable those aims might be. This is core thinking, and it ought to be up here in the head that actually good business can be green business, so that big corporates, the supermarkets as well, they do want to have a sustainable platform. Why? They want to actually encourage their customers to come in, and they want to be seen to be treating their supply chain properly and actually having a green business. I talked to somebody who sits on CBI with me not long ago, and it was just after a horse meat scandal. And I mean, it's always a terror to have something like that coming out of their supply chain. This director said, I know where every lettuce leaf comes from, and I know it's been organically farmed, etc. And if it had been us, we'd have been over every newspaper on that score. So that I think it's a question, one's got to get away with the idea that big business is hostile. It's not. It wants to do the right thing. And I think where government can help is it can actually lay out a regulatory framework that makes it easier to do so. And that can be by fiscal breaks, it can be by encouraging equity investment in a smart format, etc. There are ways to do this. But I think to get over the idea that, you know, the Ellis Lowry picture and factories putting lots of chimneys or despoiling the natural landscape, that's not what business wants to be seen as or to be doing, bluntly.
Thanks, Robert. Sarah, you talk to an awful lot of companies. Does that ring true in the sense that there is this demand now for government to set some frameworks that can enable companies to accelerate on this?
Definitely, and I think the problem is it's not. It's the leading companies have recognised the opportunities that this offers, but that isn't yet mainstream. And whilst a lot of actually the innovation that's going on that has both financial and environmental benefits, you think should be happening anyway, actually without that kind of green innovation push, often lots of these solutions don't come to the fore. So I think the government needs to start introducing legislation to really push that innovation forward. And I think the voice of the business community needs to get stronger. Those that have recognised that sustainability and improved financial results can go hand in hand need to get stronger. Often in terms of regulation, there's a much stronger voice, no matter what the regulation is, arguing against it than there are for. I mean, there are a couple of great examples in the environmental space where the opposite is true. So take landfill tax, for example. That was a small group of companies that were really progressive on this, that managed to successfully lobby the government for a tax in this area. The government introduced a tax that was simple, it was offered certainty, and back to Julia's point, you know, it was started at a certain level, it was going to go up a certain amount every year, and businesses were able to react to that, and the figures around the reductions in waste to landfill are absolutely fantastic. And for that reason, that policy is still in place. Similarly with CFCs, that was a lobbying, in part the reason that legislation was passed, which was obviously at a global level, was because there were some companies who'd come up with a solution who were effectively lobbying for it, as well as just looking at the scientific evidence. So I think what we really need is a stronger voice from the business community to enable the government and empower them to actually introduce regulation along these lines. So all of you talk to the trade associations that you're members of, be it the CBI, the Institute of Directors, whatever industry bodies that you and your executives are part of, to get this conversation going, so that when the government come out to speak to businesses, industry groups, etc., that they get that really strong message back that actually it isn't a choice between doing the right thing by the environment and doing well financially, and actually, if we look at this right, we can get that sweet spot in the middle.
Indeed, and thanks for the reminder of the power of the landfill levy, and it's just worth picking up on that, because it's a very powerful reminder of how this is not a party political agenda, because if you look back on that particular tool, it was introduced in the Conservative Party manifesto in 1992, and it was introduced alongside the first carbon policies in the UK, the fuel duty escalator, alongside renewable energy incentives, and just gives you a sense that the political pendulum, when it comes to these issues, it hasn't got any particular one end of the spectrum or the other. It's right across the board. And I think, just as we think about where we can find support for some of these things, I think it's very important to remember that there is a natural heartland in all of the political parties on this stuff, actually, if the argument can be made right. Now, Martin, you mentioned a couple of very powerful figures that certainly get me very excited straight away, in terms of 1 million green jobs, £5 billion of revenues in the balance of payments favour on the green technology side. Why is it that we don't get more traction, do you think, from the parties on those kinds of numbers? Why aren't they talking about that as we are?
I think part of it is that they don't actually know how to stimulate business to do, if you like, the things that they intend. Research by DEFRA shows, an even bigger number, which is a £23 billion a year saving from low-cost, no-cost resource efficiency measures. The question would be, why isn't business taking it on? Partly it's about competing priorities, but I think it's also partly about skills and capability. I don't think that the education system in the UK has been delivering the sorts of capabilities that business need to come into business and into the world of work to actually deliver innovative solutions. But I also don't think that government has been very effective in driving innovation through its own procurement. And I think there's a real opportunity for government to mandate forms of I almost saw Robert blink when I say mandate, but when we're talking about business. But I think government buys an awful lot of stuff. It commissions an awful lot of stuff, and yet what we have at the moment in terms of the recovery is very, very little R&D investment from business. They're sitting on pots of money, and yet we're not making the breakthroughs that we could. And I think there's a lot more that could be done in government procurement policies to actually drive innovation and spend on R&D, and actually support companies being, both taking a bit more risk, but also holding their hand a little bit further than maybe the Technology Strategy Board does, so that we actually turn these companies into businesses that are going to be really, really successful. I think we're too soft in terms of standing back and saying, well, we'll give that resource for a certain period, but then you've got to go and find the money elsewhere, but you haven't got quite proof of concept, and all of a sudden, someone somewhere else in the world has had some public support to actually turn that into a winning company. And I think we could do an awful lot on that.
Indeed. Thanks, Martin. Robert wants to come back on that one.
Yeah, on R&D, I couldn't agree more. I think an enterprise and innovation economy is actually very, very successful. I mean, particularly with the advances we've made in IT. We have a dragon's den within our company, and we encourage people to bring ideas, and we booked some money to actually develop new projects, and this sounds very prosaic, but it's actually on message. A guy who works on a project in Shropshire said, we waste all our street sweepings. All street sweepings are technically hazardous and have to be treated, and you can't recompost them or reuse them. So we've built, and it looks like a Heath Robinson affair, and we're just about to build the second. But effectively, it takes all the aggregate, it takes all the glass, it takes all the ferrous, it takes all the plastic out of it. It takes the soil and the compost, which we then regrade. So effectively, even the rubbish from the street is actually going back into a recycling environment. And I found a very nice Georgian fork in the skip when I was up there the other day, so benefits as well.
Great, thank you. Julie, just on listening to this, on the kind of high narrative of political parties and the role of big business in shaping that, you're close to the public and where the people are at, the people who will vote on these manifestos. Do you see any sense of change of mood as you're trying to encourage more people to put small amounts of money into renewables?
Well, in October last year, the British public put 25 million into solar farms directly, straight in, not through a fund or anything else. They literally went and bought or lent money to it. And the total amount of raised for renewables from the general public was £1 billion. So to some extent, they're talking with their money. I guess, like the rest of the panel, I spend far too much time in Westminster. And I'm afraid I've got a slightly more cynical view, particularly potentially of some of the ministers directly involved in, energy or maybe climate change. And my perception of it is they really just want to win the votes. Because that's how they stay in power. So the purpose of the manifesto for me is to get in there with what we want. So I think if we could just constantly think about people power in the mix, I think corporates have a huge role to play. We did a big piece of research with Penshaw and Berland, who are Obama's pollsters, about whether people would put their money into energy. And they love energy, but the thing that scored higher than energy on the research was it's not a bank. So the dissatisfaction with the financial system is also huge. Right. And in the absence of a bank, a corporate or a brand has a huge role to play just in terms of that reassurance or endorsement of doing things alongside. So I guess I say the same thing for government as I would for the big corporates. We need that leadership, but actually there's a huge amount that we can do. And so if I was sitting in here in a big corporate and I was actually seriously making some of these investments and changes and doing zero waste, CSR is the dullest thing on earth. There's no point in trying to put it on the cover of your financial report. Why don't you say, we're investing 50 million in greening our supply chain, and for every £1 that you put in, we'll match it. I mean, try and see your customer base as partners in the solution, as opposed to us and them, and the same thing for government from that point of view. I mean, I can't be leaving it to the politicians. It's not going to happen.
No, thank you. I tell you what, let's just thank the panel for all of their contributions so far. I think this is a good moment to go to the rest of the room and to hear a few ideas from all of you. And perhaps the thing to pick up on is the point Julia just left us with there. If this isn't attractive to the voters, it's not going to get in the manifestos. So are there any contributions from the room in terms of things you might have not heard here, or things that you might want to adapt to get more votes behind them, to make it more visibly in the interests of politicians to go with this? There's a microphone just coming. Maybe if you just say your name quickly and then we'll know who you are. Thank you.
I'm Sam Foster and I'm an architect from Scotland. I've set up my own business a couple of years ago and I'm a small business. What role do you think the small businesses have to play in greening the manifestos? That's not me. Do you think the parties should be approaching the smaller businesses, thinking what impact they can have, as well as big business?
Okay, thank you. I'll tell you what, just hang on to these for a second. Just take a note of the things you're hearing, because we will run out of time fairly soon, unfortunately. But we'll get a few more contributions from the floor, and any suggestions welcome. Questions to the panel, comments, all of that is welcome. We've got 1, 2, 3, 4. Let's have those 4, and then we'll just come for a quick roundup, and then unfortunately we'll need to close. Go ahead, please.
Dennis Doman, chartered environmentalist. Julia, I think the point that you make, the point that you make about, I think you're talking about winning hearts and minds. So can we depoliticise the environmental agenda? And shouldn't we do it? And shouldn't we take it out of the political arena and get some really charismatic people driving it. People like the late Steve Jobs, people like Bill Gates, who are charismatic and can lead and are looking about value, not just money, and tapping into what people value rather than just pure economics. I'd leave you with that thought because just a straight example, if you travel to London regularly, you'll be thrust with an Evening Standard or a Metro. There's no value because everybody leaves it. But if you buy a paper, you'll take it home with you. You might read it all week because it's got value. I'll leave you with that thought.
Thank you very much. So, gentleman over in the corner, over the far corner, over that side. Can you put your hand up again so microphone can find you? Thank you.
Thank you very much. It's Barry Clark. I'd like to support the last speaker and just to say, is it ever credible anymore to talk about the environment not in terms of business and economics? We're talking about the manifesto here. Really, the panel has talked about business mainly. I understand why, but perhaps in terms of inspiring people, there is another way.
Thank you very much. And we had a couple over here. Let's just have those two.
Hi, Tony Miller. I provide support for schools around creating a better understanding of sustainability. It's nice to hear education spoken about on the panel, and it tends to be a fairly rare item. But it's a massive opportunity that is lost by not tapping into the education system, and that's right from the very start of the education system. Not only to create that understanding of sustainability, but also to tap into the future people who will need to be employed within an industry that is growing at a phenomenal rate.
Thank you. Thank you. And there was just one more there. I think that's all we've got time for. Then we'll just come back to the panel very briefly. Go ahead, please.
Mark Griffiths. I work for Ideal Word. We're sustainable copywriters. Why waste time trying to influence mainstream political parties who cannot and will not shift on sustainability? There is already a political party who would agree with most of what anybody has said in this room, apart from maybe Julia. It's called the Green Party. If you want to change hearts and minds, put money behind the party that actually wants to change because it's in their DNA. They'd say, it's not about the money, it's more about the honey. That's what they care about. And I'm a Green, and I would support it and say that, wouldn't I?
Thank you very much indeed. So plenty of food for thought from all of those. I'm just going to invite the panellists just to give us a couple of final thoughts. We'll start the other end. So Julia, would you like to give us a few closing remarks?
So clearly I vote Green, but I'm not going to spend the next 10 years preaching to the converted. Education is really, really key, and I think that's why solar schools has been so huge, because it's just so real when it's on your roof and you've got something to talk about, so I'd really encourage that. I think the role of leadership is fundamental. Our main patron and supporter is Vivienne Westwood, and her mantra, which I held on a placard on a fracking march on Tuesday, is what's good for the climate is good for the economy. And she's probably bloody right. I must get you two together. She's quite entertaining for lunch. And in terms of small business, I think there's a real opportunity there, because that is what the government are into. Access to finance, funds running into the real economy, growth in that sector. Everyone sees SMEs as where the growth and recovery is going to come from. And that is really the reason why we've got through the ISA barrier, why we've got good regulations for crowd lending, is because they see that the banks are not lending to that sector and the growth isn't coming through. So I think that is one aspect of the political agenda we can tap into as well.
Excellent. I was very pleased to hear the mention of SMEs. I think they are a very big employer in the UK economy, and I think they need to be listened to, responded to and considered. And I think that means providing the environment where it's easy for them to be a sustainable business as it is for a larger corporate that can devote perhaps more resources. Secondly, I'd say I made no apology for being a businessman. I think business has a key part to play. My company touches a third of the UK population one way or another. And I think if you can get companies like large corporates, the large chemical companies, behaving properly, that will distill through their workforce, it would distill out to their customer base. So I think it's important. And I am actually a great fan of education. I think a lot of children come through our facilities. Key Stage 2 sustainability is part of it. if we're going to move the debate forward, young people are going to lead it. And I keep going back to this point, we've got to get it into people's heads that sustainability isn't something that's a creed or whatever. It's actually vital to our future existence.
Thanks very much indeed, Robert. Sarah, a few remarks?
Thanks, Tony. I'll keep this brief. Completely agree on the SME front. I mean, they're over the half the economic output of the country, and I think without greening the small businesses, we're never going to get to where we need to. And I think a lot more can be done of helping small businesses share their learnings between each other, and also helping some of the outputs that have come out of big business that do have more resources, more R&D budget, etc., and taking some of that to the SME sector. I also think it's important that we do start to look outside at party politics for some of this, and I think as soon as this becomes party political, and it is doing already, it then gets embroiled in all sorts of other arguments. And the basic message that we're all trying to give is that this is good for the economy, and that should be something that all the parties can get behind. And I think there are charismatic business leaders like the Richard Bransons of this world that are trying to do that at the moment, so doing all we can to support them. I also really think education is key. And one of the things that we're trying to do is to start educating, improving what the business schools are doing, improving what our accountancy professionals are doing. And I think this kind of environment and the qualifications are really important, because without education, we're never going to get where we need to be.
Great, thanks very much indeed, Sarah. Martin, final word for you.
On the education side, I think it's absolutely critical that we develop the creativity and the passion behind environment and sustainability with young people, because they're the people who are going to be, driving the country forward in the future. And I want, everybody who's a CEO in the next 20 years, 10 years, to actually have had this built into their very fabric of education and their DNA. In terms of SMEs, I think that they are probably the closest in terms of being there to voters and real people. And I think there's a real benefit to be had by engaging people in environment and sustainability and actually embedding that in the way in which they procure and they buy things. I think, unfortunately at the moment people buy on price and virtually price alone. So, the guy who mentioned about the paper and if you get something for free, people will take it, they won't use it. But actually, and the utility value is probably zero. And I think that's about changing hearts and minds. I just think the final point I would like to make, just in terms of broader sustainability that I would like to see in the manifestos, is the UK has done really well in terms of supporting international development to the tune of 0.7% of GDP under the Millennium Development Goals for international aid. And I think as we're talking about some of the UK's past and current policies which have global impacts on climate change, then that flow of money is absolutely critical to support other people on the planet who've got to deal with the consequences in some of our procurement and buying habits.
Thanks very much, and indeed thanks to all the panellists. So this is the beginning of the conversation that we've started with Society for the Environment this year, to be looking at proposals that we can offer to the parties later on in the autumn to be shaping the manifestos. Join the conversation on Twitter, #GreenGov we're using to pull the tweets together on this subject. And if you are interested in finding out how the conversation is going, go to the SOCEMV website, where you can also find details about how you might wish to enter the process of being chartered environmentalists if you are not already. So final thank you to our panel, and I hope you enjoyed the conversation. Thanks very much.